Hello there. In this video, I'm going to talk about the Long Branch Streetcar. This is a streetcar that is a bit unique in that its importance wasn't necessarily to the city of Toronto, but instead to some other municipalities on the fringes of the city. So, let's get into the video. The origins of the Long Branch Streetcar can be found in the late 1800s. In 1890, the Globe newspaper would write an article about an up-and-coming village to the west of Toronto called New Toronto. In the article, the Globe would state, "On the borders of the city, there is an embryo town growing up which promises in time to equal, if not surpass, Old Toronto as a commercial center." New Toronto, alongside the villages of Long Branch and Etobicoke, were beginning to develop into communities of their own with places to both live and work. The people living and working in these burgeoning communities needed a way to get into the city center, and so an interurban line was proposed to connect these growing villages. On November 14th, the Toronto and Etobicoke Railway and Light Company would be formed to build and operate this interurban line, as well as to sell electricity for additional revenue. York County would approve the construction and issue a 21-year operating charter on December 23rd. The Etobicoke Township and Provincial Legislature would do the same soon after. The line would be built to the same track gauge as the Toronto Railway Company, and the Provincial Legislature granted permission for the expropriation of land for the right-of-way, as well as allowed for an eastern extension to Dufferin Street. Construction of the line would begin in August of 1891 at the corner of Queen Street and Roncesvalles Avenue and proceed west. On July 16, 1892, the Etobicoke line had made it to the Humber River. By this point, the line had become popular with travelers from the city who used it to access the beaches along the Humber Bay. This, however, would mean that ridership on the line was seasonal, and ridership and revenue would dry up during the winter months. The route at this point was useless to those on the other side of the Humber River for whom this line was being built to serve. On July 1st, 1893, the Toronto and Etobicoke Railway and Light Company would be purchased by Sir William Mackenzie, who would add it to his growing portfolio of railways and interurbans. The line would then be extended west to the Etobicoke Creek on July 10th, and by September 29th, the Etobicoke line had made its way to Kipling Avenue. On July 1st, 1895, the Etobicoke line had made its way to the Etobicoke Creek in the village of Long Branch. With each westward extension of the line, ridership slowly increased, and the villages it served would reap the benefits it brought through further growth and development. The radial railway itself by this point was also turning a modest profit. In 1903, the Toronto and Etobicoke Radial Railway would receive permission to extend its interurban further west to the city of Hamilton. The T&MRR would enter into an agreement with the Hamilton Radial Electric Railway to link their two networks together. The Toronto and Etobicoke would build west, while the Hamilton would build east, with the two systems linking up in Oakville. The Hamilton Radial Railway would reach Oakville. The Etobicoke line, however, wouldn't, as the Toronto and Etobicoke had a hard time extending into Port Credit, and a single landowner refused to sell their land, holding up the process. The Etobicoke line would reach Hurontario Street on December 24, 1905, and would reach the Credit River a year later on November 19, 1906. By this point, however, the money for the project had dried up, and the interurban would go no further west, although the gap from Port Credit to Oakville had been surveyed. In the years following, attempts were made to extend the Etobicoke line into downtown Toronto. This, however, was met with opposition from the City of Toronto, which opposed all radial railways entering Toronto. This opposition was mostly born out of spite, as the City of Toronto, to put it mildly, despised Sir William Mackenzie, who by this point also just happened to own every radial railway in Toronto. On December 1st, 1920, the City of Toronto would purchase the Etobicoke line from the Toronto and Etobicoke Radial Railway, as their 21-year charter was coming to an end. The city would hand off the line to the Ontario Hydroelectric Power Commission. Operations of the line would be headed by a man named Adam Beck, who had a grand vision for a network of interurban railways operating and bringing passenger service throughout southern Ontario. A key to this vision, however, was a high-speed connection into downtown Toronto. The city of Toronto would balk at this idea. Beck's proposal would require a 6-track right-of-way along the city's waterfront. The city would counter this with a 4-track right-of-way that would have to be shared by the recently created Toronto Transportation Commission. Property owners adjacent to the proposed right-of-way, such as the Canadian National Exhibition and the Toronto Harbour Commission, had also opposed the plan. This opposition, as well as an Ontario Premier who viewed trains and interurbans as an obsolete technology, would mean that Adam Beck's plan for a Southern Ontario interurban network would die. On January 12, 1927, the Mimico line would be handed back over to the City of Toronto, and the line would now be operated by the TTC. Service on the Mimico Radial Railway would come to an end on September 27, 1928. The TTC would commence the restoration of the route, which included the tearing up of the old well-worn tracks, and the line double-tracked to Brown's Line, where today's Long Branch Loop is. Lakeshore Boulevard would also be widened as part of this project. A short turn loop would also be constructed on Kipling Avenue, with this loop being referred to as New Toronto on streetcar roll signs, at least up until the late 1970s. A single track Y would also be built on Hillside Avenue, although it is doubtful that this Y would have seen very much use. The Y was still connected to the streetcar network up to 2002, making it the last of its kind in the network. Service would begin on the new Lakeshore Streetcar on December 8, 1928, with the line operating from Long Branch Loop to Church Street. Residents of the villages of Long Branch, New Toronto, and Mimico would be charged an extra fare to enter the city, but this didn't matter as the new direct service into downtown Toronto would bring out the riders. Service west of Long Branch would continue to operate, although it left much to be desired. The Port Credit Streetcar would operate from Long Branch Loop to the Credit River in Mississauga, although service on the line only operated at half-hour intervals and ridership was too low to justify double-tracking the line. Over the years, ridership on the Port Credit Streetcar would continue to decline as more people turned to driving or taking the bus. Service on the Port Credit Streetcar would come to an end on February 9, 1935, and it would be replaced by the Port Credit bus. This bus route would disappear in 1974 after being transferred to Mississauga Transit. Into the 1930s, service on the Lakeshore Streetcar would be changed to now loop via York Street, Richmond Street, and Victoria Street. This would lead to a lot of congestion on these roads, as the Lakeshore Streetcar from Roncesvalles Avenue to York Street duplicated the service provided by the Beach Streetcar. To address this, the TTC would construct 2 new loops. Beach and Queen streetcars would now loop at the newly built McCall Loop, while Lakeshore streetcars would now continue east to the newly built Mutual Loop. On October 28, 1935, the Lakeshore Streetcar would be split into 2, giving birth to the Long Branch Streetcar. The Long Branch Streetcar would operate from Long Branch Loop to Roncesvalles Car House. The Lakeshore Streetcar would now operate from Parkside Loop to Mutual Loop, with rush hour service continuing to Humber Loop. A permanent looping facility for the Long Branch Streetcar would open at Queen Street and Roncesvalles Avenue on March 14, 1936. The Lakeshore Streetcar would continue to operate until August 2, 1937, when it was merged with the Beach Streetcar to form today's Queen Streetcar. The old Queen Streetcar would be renamed as the Kingston Road Streetcar. On October 26, 1942, as part of the war effort, the Long Branch Streetcar would be extended into Mississauga, with the line now heading to the newly built Small Arms Loop. This would mark the return of streetcars into Mississauga after the Port Credit Streetcar was abolished in 1935. This extension was requested by the Dominion government and built in order to bring workers to the weapons plant owned by Small Arms Limited, which was part of the Long Branch Arsenal. During the war, all Long Branch streetcars would serve Small Arms Loop. After the war ended, streetcars would continue to serve Small Arms Loop as production wound down at the plant. On October 13, 1945, service to Small Arms Loop would officially end and all Long Branch streetcars would now return to their normal terminus at Long Branch Loop. The TTC would quickly tear up the tracks in Mississauga and across the Etobicoke Creek Bridge. The TTC would claim they would be trespassing on the bridge, and it was believed the provincial government wanted to expand the road, which would have kicked the TTC off the bridge anyways. As well, the TTC did not consider constructing new tracks as they did not believe the ridership was there to justify streetcar service into that part of Mississauga after the war. This decision wasn't without criticism though, as the Reeve of Long Branch, Tom Carter, had believed the TTC could continue to use the bridge across the Etobicoke Creek and had hoped the Small Arms plant could be repurposed for peacetime use. They would also lament that taking the Port Credit bus into Mississauga required an additional 5-cent fare, which now hadn't been the case during the wartime streetcar operations. The Long Branch Council would try to appeal to the TTC to retain service into Mississauga, but this was to no avail. The line west of the Etobicoke Creek would be dismantled and the fare zone we know today between Toronto and Mississauga re-established. The streetcar was gone from Mississauga and it would never come back. In 1958, as part of the Gardiner Expressway project, Lakeshore Boulevard would be realigned. Due to this, a new streetcar right-of-way would be built along an extended Queensway. The old tracks along Lakeshore Boulevard would be torn up and the bridge linking Roncesvalles Avenue to Lakeshore Boulevard torn down. The Long Branch streetcar would now be rerouted to Humber Loop, where it would connect to an extended Queen streetcar. Some Long Branch streetcars would, however, continue into the downtown core during rush hour, with cars looping via Church Street, Richmond Street, and Victoria Street. Into the 1970s, the Long Branch streetcar would be one of the routes used to test the new CLRV and ALRV streetcars. And with their rollout, the Long Branch streetcar would be given the route number 507. The Long Branch streetcar would eventually become a symbol of a bygone era. Prior to the 1970s, Toronto was split into two fare zones and passengers coming from outside of Toronto would need to pay an additional fare. In the case of the Long Branch streetcar, this would occur at Humber Loop. Here, passengers coming from Long Branch, New Toronto, Mimico, and South Etobicoke would have to transfer from the Long Branch streetcar to the Queen streetcar and pay an additional fare while doing so. After the 1970s though, this fare zone division was gone and now some began to question the reasoning for retaining the division in streetcar service. The TTC themselves would begin to ask if a direct streetcar route from Long Branch into the downtown core without a transfer would be a way to get residents of southern Etobicoke out of their cars. The TTC would test this out in 1992 with a direct downtown service running along Lakeshore Boulevard, Queensway, and King Street. This test would prove successful and would eventually manifest itself as the 508 Lakeshore streetcar. In 1995, the TTC Planning Department, as part of its service plan, would recommend the 507 Long Branch be extended full-time into downtown Toronto, looping via Church Street, Richmond Street, and Victoria Street. This plan was to be part of a greater plan that would see the 501 Queen streetcar continue to operate a base service between Neville Park Loop and Humber Loop, while routes like the 502 Downtowner, 503 Kingston Road, and 507 Long Branch offer supplemental service in the east and west ends respectively. For reasons only known to the TTC, however, they would ignore this proposal and pursue a different one. Instead, on March 26, 1995, the TTC would merge the 507 Long Branch and the 501 Queen streetcars together, ending 60 years of service. This newly expanded Queen Streetcar would be the longest in the city at a length of 24.65 kilometers and would run from Neville Park Loop at the border of Scarborough to Long Branch Loop at the border of Mississauga. The line would operate a split service with some cars turning back at Humber Loop. However, the length of the Queen Streetcar would now become a problem, and some would question if killing the Long Branch Streetcar was the right thing to do. A merged Queen and Long Branch streetcars, however, isn't all that new, as night service on the Long Branch Streetcar had been provided as part of overnight service on the Queen Streetcar. There is, however, a difference between the services required at night and that required during the day. The Queen Streetcar was no stranger to reliability issues, as many residents along the east end of the line complained about the number of cars being short-turned before reaching Woodbine Avenue. Now, with the route essentially doubled in length with the addition of the western end of the line, things were only likely going to get worse. Residents in southern Etobicoke fared no better, as while they now had a direct line into downtown Toronto, half of the streetcars on the route were turned back at Humber Loop. The Queen Streetcar had a headway of one car every 5 minutes, but along the western end of the route this had dropped to one every 10 minutes if you're lucky. Evening service would see service deteriorate to one car every 20 minutes. While service on the old Long Branch Streetcar was every 12 minutes, this service was far more consistent and reliable due to its shorter length. The Queen Streetcar, on the other hand, was far more unreliable, even if the difference in headway was the same on paper. As one may expect, the ridership along this stretch of the route began to decrease. Proposals would be made to remedy this issue, with one looking at constructing tracks along Lakeshore Boulevard in a right-of-way similar to that on Spadina and St. Clair. The 509 Harbourfront would then be extended along these new tracks, thus giving residents of southern Etobicoke direct access to Union Station via this Waterfront West LRT. This proposal, however, would go nowhere due to a lack of funds. Local residents would organize and ask the TTC to consider resurrecting the Long Branch Streetcar and operating the route from Long Branch Loop to Dundas West Station. This idea, too, however, would go nowhere. In 2007, commissioners from the TTC would attend meetings held by the Rocket Riders Advocacy Group to hear proposals for better service on the Queen Streetcar. Among these was a proposal to resurrect the Long Branch Streetcar. The TTC would instead implement a 6-week trial run that would see the Queen Streetcar split into two, with service overlapping between Dufferin Street and Parliament Street. After 6 weeks, the trial would end and the TTC would restore the Queen car to its regular service, although critics argued the TTC never gave the service plan a chance to succeed. The TTC would implement the 145 Humber Bay Downtown Express bus, which charged a premium fare and operated from Kipling Avenue to downtown Toronto. In 2015, the TTC and the City of Toronto would announce investments into the city's transit network, which included the introduction of 10-minute headways on surface routes. This included the Queen Streetcar. As part of this work, the TTC would look at ways to expand service on the Queen Streetcar line. Up to this point, half of all Queen cars would turn back at Humber Loop. Under the new service plan, this couldn't happen. At the time, the Queen Streetcar used larger ALRV cars, which could carry more people than the standard CLRV cars. However, a mixture of having a shortage of ALRV cars and low ridership on the west end of the line meant that service on the Queen Streetcar would need to be changed. To achieve these goals, the TTC would split the Queen Streetcar in two, with service being split at Humber Loop. Queen would now operate as two separate routes, and for all intents and purposes, the Long Branch Streetcar was back in every way but name. Some cars would now operate exclusively between Long Branch Loop and Humber Loop, while the rest would run between Neville Park Loop and Humber Loop. Even though residents of southern Etobicoke would now have to transfer from one Queen car to another at Humber Loop, service on the western end of the line would be far more reliable now that it didn't need to contend with downtown traffic. The Long Branch Streetcar has an interesting history, starting originally as an interurban line designed to help develop the villages of Mimico, New Toronto, and Long Branch, essentially to build streetcar suburbs. The Long Branch Streetcar itself would form its own history, being one of only 2 streetcars to completely leave Toronto as a whole and enter Mississauga alongside the short-lived Port Credit Streetcar. While it may not have been the first, it was certainly the last to do this. The Long Branch Streetcar, however, is also a good case study on the complexity of service planning. Even after the fare zone system was abolished, the Long Branch Streetcar continued to terminate at Humber Loop, forcing a linear transfer. And while normally streamlining service is to everyone's benefit, in this case it really wasn't. We would learn with the merger of the Long Branch and Queen streetcars that sometimes there is a reason for such oddities as the forced transfer at Humber Loop. On paper, merging the 2 routes and providing a 1-seat ride into the downtown makes sense, yet in practice, doing this would actually make service for the residents of South Etobicoke worse. With a 24-kilometer line that operates in mixed traffic through the downtown core, reliability issues were guaranteed to occur. In this particular instance, having the linear transfer at Humber Loop would ultimately be for the better. While you may now have a minor inconvenience of having to transfer from one car to another to continue your journey, this is made up for by the increased reliability of the more localized service provided along the western end of the line. Usually, I would now do a what-if scenario looking at what a modern Long Branch streetcar could look like. But in this case, I don't have to since it still exists, just under a different name. That said, there are still proposals for a resurrected Long Branch streetcar running from Long Branch Loop to Dundas West Station. While there is no doubt this could be done, there is the question of if it's viable from a passenger perspective. As well, Dundas West Station is already the terminus of the Dundas and King streetcars, so I don't think we could fit another streetcar line into it without another reconfiguration of the station. There is also the proposed Waterfront West LRT, which could bring faster service to Western Toronto from Union Station. While the alignment has changed, this is really just the same idea that was proposed in 1992 to remedy the issue at hand. In typical Toronto fashion, we are still talking about it nearly 30 years later. Ultimately though, the Long Branch Streetcar is and was an important line for Toronto. It and its predecessors helped establish 3 new municipalities on the very outer fringes of Toronto. It, like many other streetcars, helped ferry workers to and from the small arms munitions plant during World War II. And today it is still an important line used by many on their daily commutes. Even if it goes by a different name, the Long Branch Streetcar lives on in what it brings to the southwest end of Toronto and for the people that use it daily. And with that, I will end this video here. Thank you for watching this video, and if you enjoyed it and want to see more like it, please hit that subscribe button because there are more videos like it on the channel and there are more videos like it on the way. If there's anything you want to say about the Long Branch Streetcar, don't be afraid to do so in the comments section down below. And with that, I'll see you in the next video.